Okay, so very quickly, I want to go over this primary source analysis for week 6 on industrialization. First and foremost, I hope you did take the time to read how to read a primary source because it's very important that you understand the different ways that we do this. Most of you seem to do pretty well, but many of you didn't actually do as I put in here in quotes or in big print, use quotes and cite them internally to support your ideas. In fact, many people didn't use any citation at all, which that should be an automatic 0 because this is the first time I didn't do it. But next time, I mean, you guys know citation's mandatory. I don't even know why I'm having to say this. But okay, then you were supposed to read both of these primary sources. Um, the letter from Marshall Dilling opposing the Keating-Owen child labor bill, and the life of the industrial worker in 19th century England. I didn't give you specific quotes or citations for those because I wanted you to try to figure them out. And this is important when we're talking about stuff like this. So, with that in mind, the next statement, answer each of the following questions for each source. Answer as thoroughly as you can with quotes internally cited to support. That also means you needed to have that works cited at the end. So I'm quickly going to go through this and give you effectively a summation of things that you could have used in your answers and the way you should be looking at this. All right, so for Dilling, the purpose was effectively to prevent the passage of the Keating-Owen bill. Now, as the quotes I have here from Dilling, it would appear that he was a citizen of the United States, probably from North or South Carolina, as per his quote from the letter. My opinion is based on experience of 23 years in cotton mills of the Carolinas, and my father put me to work in a cotton mill when I was 11 years of age. The internal citation right there, Dilling, 1916. The objective is to get the senator to whom he sent this letter to not support the passage of the Keating-Owen child labor bill, which would have prevented children from working in cotton mills, as per this quote. The real sufferers will be the people who depend on the cotton mills and other industries for a livelihood. And again, there's your internal citation. I would also point out the letterhead, and some of you did notice this, which is very good. The letterhead is from a textile company. And at the top of it has all of its major executives listed, which suggests that they were supportive of this letter because you can't just use company letterhead and send letters without someone giving permission. Dilling is not listed as one of the executives, but to use letterhead, he would have had to have had permission, so it is probable that the company itself, certainly its executives, were against the passage of the law. In this case, as the letterhead seems to place this particular branch of the company in Celoria, Alabama, it's also the place where the Secretary of Treasurer, F.M. Thompson, works. Dilling could also have been living there or working for one of the mills, possibly even the one in Concord, North Carolina, which is also listed on the letterhead. All right. Life of industrial worker. Now, many of you went to the introduction to the letter, which is fine. Or not letter, I'm sorry. The introduction to the primary source, which is fine. They do normally, when you read a primary source, there is a little introductory section that gives you the setup for it. In this particular case, this is an interview. And what makes this complicated is that you've got literally two different sets of information coming out of it. You've got the questions themselves, which are coming from the committee created by Matthew Sadler, or the Sadler Committee. And then you've got the answers in this excerpt, which are coming from Michael Crabtree. So you've got two different things to bear in mind with this, and also two different interpretations of what's going on. Sadler's objective was pretty apparent in the nature of the questions themselves, as in the question, what was the consequence if you had been too late? In those mills is chastisement toward the latter part of the day going on perpetually, and the word perpetually is kind of a key word. I mean, it's all the time. Is this happening all the time or just sometimes? He doesn't even ask how often it happens. He frames the question so that when Crabtree answers, he's going to have to say perpetually. And then, so that you can hardly be in a mill without hearing constant crying, which, of course, So this is also part of how the questions themselves are leading. From the perspective of Crabtree, and I should have included this in this as well, um, Crabtree is basically been invited in to answer these questions. And his purpose is in answering the questions as anybody would be when they were tasked with coming before a governmental committee to address things. And in that manner, when we get to reliability later, it actually makes him particularly more reliable than the committee itself, which is using these leading questions. All right, so what is the audience for the document? How does the audience influence the document? For Dilling, the audience is the U.S. Senator. So effectively, Dilling is trying to be concise. He's trying to put everything in there as concisely as he can. He's trying to appeal to a probably Southern senator's perspectives. That's part of where the whole point about states' rights comes in. Um, and he's trying very hard to look at it from an economic perspective and to say things that would make this important to a senator. The Sadler Committee's audience is going to be Parliament, because Parliament created the Sadler Committee, and by way of Parliament, the public of Britain itself. And thus, that's probably why the bias of many of these questions goes towards um, evoking emotions and trying to get people to understand what may well have been an extreme situation. The Sadler Committee was working to encourage the passing of legislation to limit working hours for children and for women. The biased perspective, or the audience, as it were, again, for Crabtree himself, was going to be the committee. So again, he's trying to answer them probably in the most effective way that he knows how, because they're asking him these questions. So he's going to go, he's going to answer them as honestly as he can. Presuppositions. What does the author of the document take for granted about his society that we might find objectionable today? Well, in all of them, of course, it's the whole issue of child labor. We all find that uncomfortable today because today, unlike in the past, we believe that there is a distinct period of time in a human life that is called childhood, and that period of time is formative, and that children shouldn't be overwhelmed with adult responsibilities. But that's a very new and very modern way of thinking, and it doesn't actually start until effectively World War II, I think. There's a lot of good histories of childhood out there, or history of the concept of childhood, but certainly it didn't exist in this industrial revolution period. I would point out also these documents are about 100 years apart. The Sadler Committee document is coming out of 1832. The Dilling letter is coming out of 1916. So Dilling is taking for granted that children need to work, that families should be able to rely on children to pay their way, if not contribute to the family as a whole. He doesn't think that it was exceptional that he himself started to work at the age of 11, nor does he think it was wrong. He also takes for granted the power of the state over that of the federal government, which this is a U.S. history thing, but it's also something that I think most of your textbooks address, that in the wake of the Civil War, even though the federal government won, there's still a period of rehabilitation, reconstruction, and then what is referred to as the redemption period, where there's a lot going on in terms of the United States federal government accommodating the South in the wake of the Civil War. In terms of the Sadler Committee itself, it takes for granted that working in the textile mills is hard, and even harder for children, which is again part of where we get to the nature of the leading questions, but also where we get to some of Mr. Crabtree's answers, such as the use of the word humane person here. Do you think if the overlooker were naturally a humane person, it would still be found necessary for him to beat the children? To which he says yes, because the work and labor is so hard that the kids get exhausted and they go to sleep. So this is leading towards this idea that the Sadler Committee has already come upon that this is not the right way for children to live, and thus they're trying to sell this to Parliament and to the committee itself. There are more quotes in here, many of them very disquieting. The whole idea about even when you're home, you're not with your family because you're tired and all you're going to do is sleep, that your parents don't have time to instruct you, that you sometimes don't even have time to eat dinner, or if you do, you fall asleep while it's being prepared, and that you were so afraid of getting beaten at work and the abuse at work that you would cry all the way to work. So. All right, so again, the big thing today in this opinion position, and again, your opinion is what your opinion is, but we oppose the idea overall of child labor, especially at 11 years of age or 8 years of age or even younger, and it's especially if it's really dangerous labor. In the United States, debate about federal versus state power is still wide open, especially with the recent Supreme Court decision reversing Roe versus Wade. So all of that is still front and center with us. All right, epistemology. Now, epistemology is a hard word, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining it. It basically means trying to find what we refer to as the truth or the search for the truth. I think of it more in terms of context. How do these sources fit into the context of what you're reading historically, what you're getting from whatever textbook you're using, as well as Harari and Frankopan? And I would point out that, again, I requested here that you use page citations. And I went specifically to the chapters we were using this week. I appreciate and I gave credit to those of you who were looking at Frankopan and Harari holistically, and not just at the chapters that were required for week 6, even though I do think that you should have addressed the information in week 6. It could very credibly be argued that there is nothing in Frankopan's chapter 16 that talks about child labor at all, because there isn't. But if you're going to say that, you need to tell me what that chapter does talk about. And for Frankopan, it is the lead up to the July crisis that's going to set up World War I. Harari's is more on point because he talks about the Industrial Revolution, recounting the evolution of industrialization from the ancient world to the use of coal in Britain instead of firewood, how that leads to the development of the steam engine, and then from there into textiles and trains and transportation. He goes on from there to talk about other things such as that whole horrific section on the modern day animal industry. And I think probably the most significant quote that comes out of it that we can relate in that chapter to child labor is this issue of indifference. Just as this Atlantic slave trade did not stem from hatred toward Africans, so the modern animal industry is not motivated by animosity. Again, it's fueled by indifference. And I think that directly goes to what especially the Sadler Committee was trying to do, which was to overcome the indifference of the people of Britain and to make them see how bad things were for children who were being forced to work. It also, in some respects, goes to the indifference that you see in the Dilling letter. He's indifferent to the problems that children have because they have to work. He sees it in a more practical and economically expedient way. I also think in that respect, you can take the last part of Harari's chapter on the emergence of consumerism as being part of the Dilling argument. That's part of what he's looking at. These families need the money. We need to produce these goods. Some of Crabtree's answers also support the idea of indifference. Your parents don't have time for you. We didn't have time to eat, and these are the things that they're trying to use to get past that social indifference to the plight of workers. All of the textbooks discuss the rise of poverty and living conditions of industrial workers. If you're using Cordas, it's in section 10.2. We're talking about the reform movements that were brought on by industrialization, and in section 10.5, which talks about the passage of child labor laws, including, I might add, the labor laws that are produced by the Sadler Commission or Sadler Committee. Brooks discusses the problems of industrial society in section in the section of Chapter 2 titled Social Effects, and he talks about it also in depth. So any of those are part of this discussion. If you ignore question 4, you're ignoring a lot of your critical thinking, because epistemology, putting these documents into the context of the times, is very important. It's part of how we get, again, to the issues of reality and credibility. Sorry, I don't know that far ahead. All right. So in this sense, then, we get to the comparison of the two. And almost everyone nailed, of course, the easy answer, which is, well, they're both about child labor. They are, though, as I said, two different countries, two different times. The Sadler Committee is trying to convince Parliament to put restraints on child labor and women's labor because of the treatment of children and women. Dilling is arguing that child labor is necessary for the families of the workers because they make so little that they need the income from child labor, and also that it is a situation involving the power of the state versus the power of the federal government. Sadler is a reflection of Britain at the stage of the Industrial Revolution, where it's moving from the first to the second Industrial Revolution. And if you don't understand the difference between those two, you really need to. The focus in Britain is still on textiles and the mass production of them. At the same time, though, it is during the period when Britain is working on developing markets for these goods in places like India and China, when they're working very hard to create that consumerist economy that they need, where the government itself is moving towards capitalism and away from mercantilism. Dilling was almost 100 years later in the U.S. It takes it almost 100 years for the U.S. to get to the same point that the British were at in the early 1800s. The arguments in both cases, though, for and against child labor were the same. All right, as to reliability, they all seem reliable in that we know the historical conditions of industrialization and child labor, and you know that from your textbook. You could also see it in different parts of Harari, not necessarily the chapter that was on this week, but in other parts he talks about it. We also know that the poverty brought about by industrialization forced many families to push their children into working at young ages. Dilling himself explains his own situation. He was put to work at 11. But he doesn't address the issue of work itself and its effect on his childhood. Instead, he views it as something that was effectively a good thing for him and his family. He doesn't talk about the bad parts of it, unlike Crabtree and the Sadler Committee, both of who address specifically the horrors of child labor, but they don't address the benefit of it for the poor families, because that would, corrupt their argument. Okay, as to credibility, even though they're acknowledged, both the Sadler Committee and Dilling have objectives, and their intent leads toward that. To me, Crabtree is probably the most both reliable and credible, because he seems to answer the questions honestly. And again, part of that may be because he's intimidated. I mean, again, if you get called before some kind of governmental body to give testimony, it can be rather nerve-wracking. I find the Sadler Committee itself less credible because of the nature of their questions, which were, again, very leading questions, with using words like perpetually, humane, very grievous hardship, that sort of thing. They're leading, what in the law would be called leading the witness to answer certain ways. Dilling, of course, is a Southerner in the wake of the Civil War, during the historical period in the South known as the Redemption. He makes his states' rights argument, which is reemerging at that point in time, in hopes of it appealing to a probable Southern senator. And in that, again, one of the things that states' rights was used for in the past was the justification for slavery, the justification for a variety of other things that most of us today would find untenable, including, in this case, child labor. So, all right. I do want to point out down here, because so many of you did not have it, there's my works cited, and I can't believe y'all didn't put a works cited in here. That was going to get you very low grades on that citation clarity part. All right, so this is effectively the kinds of information I want to see in these primary source analyses, and then when you get to the primary source sources that you have to analyze for your annotated bibliography, which is due on the 21st. And I will be sending out and posting the Dropbox with all the instructions on it in the next 2 days. So, all right, if you have any questions or any questions about your grade on this, let me know.